The morning mist curled gently over the rocky coastline of a sleepy harbor town in Maine, where salt clung to the wind like memory. It was the kind of place tourists passed through without slowing down, unless they were lost, or chasing quiet. Among the weather-worn docks, a man stood ankle-deep in the shallows, casting a line with something that looked more like a science project than a fishing rod. No one paid much attention to Carter Hayes anymore. At 38, he was a single father with the calloused hands of someone who hadn't rested in years. His short brown hair was often hidden under a faded ball cap, and his flannel shirts always looked a size too large, as if trying to cover the weight he carried. His son, Max, barely 8, played nearby with a bucket and a wooden spoon, pretending to be a sea captain. Carter's eyes flicked between the bobbing net and his boy like a metronome set to protect. The net wasn't ordinary. It was something Carter had built over years, stitched with biodegradable fibers, marked with patterns that mimicked jellyfish movement, and shaped to allow small marine life to escape unharmed. It was part gear, part dream, and entirely untested in the wider world. A glossy black yacht pulled into the harbor like a swan among gulls. From it stepped Bryce Langford, CEO of Langford International, known more for yachts and tech takeovers than humility. Dressed in crisp white and sunglasses worth more than Carter's truck, Bryce sauntered toward the dock for an impromptu photo shoot with the local press. He stopped when he saw Carter's contraption. Then he laughed. Loud, sharp, the kind of laugh that cut the air. "Is that duct tape?" Bryce said, pointing at the handle. "You fishing or building a robot apocalypse?" Some chuckled. Carter didn't look up. "That's not a fishing pole," Bryce said to a reporter. "That's poverty pretending to be innovation." Carter only smiled faintly, eyes never leaving the line. He'd heard worse, much worse. But what Bryce couldn't see was that Carter had been testing this design for years. Not for fame, not for a patent, but for Max, so that his son might grow up with oceans still alive, with purpose that didn't come wrapped in arrogance. As the crowd followed Bryce back to his floating palace, Carter remained in the tide, cast after cast. Around him, the sea whispered in ways money couldn't hear. He didn't know it yet, but 3 days later, the same man who mocked him would be forced to mention his name. On a global stage neither of them had ever dreamed of. That night, Carter lay awake in the small 2-room cottage he and Max called home. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window panes and the sea murmured somewhere in the distance. Max slept curled up under a patchwork quilt, one arm tucked around a faded plush turtle. Carter watched the ceiling, his mind racing, not from Bryce's words but from the net's behavior that morning. It had worked, almost too well. Not only had it caught fish without harming the surrounding marine life, but it had also repelled invasive species that often damaged the coast's delicate ecosystem. His fingers itched to draw up notes, to log the tide patterns, to track which knots had held strongest. But there was no time. The next morning, Carter loaded his gear into a rickety old pickup and drove to a nearby university's marine lab, where he used to clean tanks in exchange for access to their research materials. Dr. Helen Monroe, an aging oceanographer with sharp eyes and a softer heart, greeted him like a ghost from her past. "Still chasing that net of yours?" she asked. He nodded, laying the folded mesh on her workbench. "It's not perfect, but I think I've got something. It mimics bioluminescence, confuses predators, attracts fish, and lets the juveniles go." Helen examined the net, running a weathered hand over the fine threads. "This isn't just clever, Carter. This is sustainable design." "You did this on your own?" "With some help from Max," Carter smiled. Later that week, Helen sent photos and test data to an old colleague at the Global Marine Sustainability Summit. They were looking for grassroots innovators to showcase, people outside the corporate bubble who were making real change. Carter had no idea she'd submitted his work. Meanwhile, in the polished halls of Langford International, Bryce sat reviewing proposals for his company's Eco-Initiative rebrand. When one assistant mentioned a net design gaining traction with oceanographers, Bryce scoffed until he saw the picture. There was Carter, faded flannel, duct tape, holding a net like it was part of him. "Who let this in?" Bryce muttered, but the board was already intrigued. Authentic stories sold better than polished lies, and if this nobody from the docks became a media darling, Bryce knew his empire might look like the fool. By the following week, Carter returned to the shore with Max, casting his net beneath skies bruised with rain. The winds had shifted, bringing with them the low growl of an incoming storm. But he didn't mind. Storms were familiar, on the water, in life. He was ankle-deep again when a woman in a navy windbreaker approached from the gravel path. "Carter Hayes?" she asked, holding out a badge. "Yeah?" "I'm Anna Royce with the Global Marine Summit. I flew in from New York. We've been reviewing your net design. Dr. Monroe sent your prototype to our committee." Carter blinked. Max peeked out from behind his leg, his tiny hand clinging to Carter's jeans. "We'd like to invite you to Geneva. You've been shortlisted for the Ocean Futures Award." Silence stretched like the horizon. I can't go to Geneva. I've never left this town. I've got my boy. I've got work. I fish to feed us." Anna crouched and smiled at Max. Maybe this is the kind of fishing the world needs to see. Carter didn't answer. He didn't trust fast words or fast planes. He'd built everything around Max's small world: school lunches, bedtime stories, calm routines. Could he leave even for a week? Back home that night, he sat beside Max listening to the storm rumble overhead. "Dad," Max whispered, "you always say we help the sea because it helps us. Maybe this is how we help it back." Carter closed his eyes. Even in his boy's voice, he heard the tide pulling. Meanwhile, on the 37th floor of Langford International, Bryce was not pleased. His PR manager had just informed him that Carter Hayes, the man he'd laughed at in front of reporters, was trending on global eco-innovation forums. Worse still, the summit had listed him as a keynote invitee. It was going viral. "How is this guy getting more traction than our entire ocean division?" Bryce barked. "You mocked him," the PR manager said quietly. "People love underdogs." Bryce's jaw tightened. Then he smiled. Cold, calculating. "Book me a flight to Geneva. I'll handle this myself." The air in Geneva was thinner than Carter expected. Polished, efficient, laced with languages he couldn't name. The city glittered beside its lake like a postcard, but Carter felt like a smudge in the corner. He wore his only decent jacket, one Max had picked out at the local thrift shop, and walked through the towering glass doors of the Global Marine Summit with the same posture he had on the dock: humble, alert, and slightly out of place. Max held his hand tightly, his sneakers squeaking on the marble floors. Carter had refused to come unless Max could be with him. The summit had agreed. Inside, there were people in suits talking about oceans like markets, charts, profits, corporate responsibility. But Carter spoke from a place deeper than any PowerPoint. When it was finally his turn to present, he stood beneath the giant screen, hands trembling slightly as he laid the net across a sleek, white table. "I didn't build this for awards," Carter began. "I built it because the sea fed my son when I couldn't, because I saw plastic where there used to be fish. I'm just a fisherman, but maybe that's enough." The hall was quiet. Then the applause rose, not just polite, but heartfelt. Backstage, a journalist handed Carter a small tablet. "You're all over the news feeds. Single dad's invention may save thousands of marine species." "That's your headline." Max beamed. "We made the news, Dad." Then Bryce Langford appeared. Sleek, smiling, and terrifyingly casual, he shook Carter's hand as cameras flashed. "Carter," he said with the confidence of a shark in still water, "your story is inspiring. Langford International would be honored to buy the rights to your design. Let's scale it. You and your boy can retire early." Carter didn't speak right away. Max watched him, his small hand still clinging to his dad's. "I didn't come here to sell something," Carter said quietly. I came to offer a solution, not a product." Bryce's smile faltered. "Come on, let's be reasonable." "No," Carter said, steady now. "Let's be responsible." The world moved faster after Geneva. Within days, news outlets across the globe aired Carter's story. The fisherman who outsmarted big tech. Interview requests flooded in. Environmental groups offered grants. Schools asked to name science labs after Max. But through it all, Carter remained grounded. He still woke at dawn, still tied his boots the same way, still packed Max's lunch with peanut butter and a handwritten note. But behind the calm, storm clouds were forming. Bryce Langford wasn't done. His offer had been rejected publicly and investors had noticed. His company's image, once a polished machine, now looked bloated and outdated next to Carter's modest truth. So he did what power does when threatened. He struck back. Langford International launched their own EcoNet design. Sleek, patented, backed by millions. But Carter knew it was a hollow copy. The materials weren't biodegradable. The escape design was flawed. Worse, they had rushed it into production without real testing. And then came the backlash. Within a month, multiple marine sanctuaries reported injuries to small sea life caught in Langford's nets. Videos surfaced, tiny turtles tangled in plastic threads. Headlines turned brutal. Corporate greenwashing exposed. Bryce denied everything, but the tide had turned. One night, as Max slept soundly, Carter sat on the porch watching the moon ripple across the harbor. Dr. Monroe called. Her voice was tired but proud. "You gave the world something real, Carter. They'll try to bury it, distort it, but truth floats, always." The next day, Carter received an official letter from the United Nations Environmental Council. He and Max had been invited to present at the annual Global Oceans Accord, not as guests, but as co-authors of a sustainability framework built around Carter's net. For once, the world wasn't just listening, it was following. 6 months later, Carter stood once more beneath a towering ceiling, but this time in New York, at the United Nations Assembly Hall. The space was filled with world leaders, scientists, and youth delegates from every corner of the earth. But to Carter, none of it compared to the feel of Max's small hand in his. The event was formal. He wore a borrowed blazer. Max wore a tie for the first time, crooked and proud. As they walked toward the stage, applause began. Not roaring, but sincere. The kind that meant people had been moved, not just impressed. Carter didn't have a teleprompter. He didn't need one. "I'm not a scientist. I'm not a businessman," he began, voice steady. "I'm just a dad and a fisherman, and one day my boy asked me why the fish were disappearing. I didn't have an answer, so I built one." He lifted the net, now mounted on a simple frame behind him. This saved more than sea life. It gave a single dad hope again. Max climbed onto the stage, standing beside him. The UN president stepped forward and presented them with the Global Guardians Award, the highest honor given to grassroots environmental heroes. But Carter didn't hold the medal. He bent down and pinned it to Max's blazer. Afterward, as they left the hall, reporters swarmed. Carter simply smiled and lifted Max onto his shoulders. A month later, coastal towns around the world began using the Haze net. Schools added it to textbooks. Young engineers studied its humble blueprint, not because it was flashy, but because it worked. Bryce Langford? He was asked to step down after a whistleblower revealed he'd tried to suppress safety data. His empire, once towering, quietly unraveled. But Carter never gloated. He just returned home, where he and Max kept fishing at dawn. Not for survival anymore, but tradition. Because some nets don't just catch fish, they hold families together, and sometimes they hold the whole world.